Hi, everyone. I'm here with a former colleague, but good friend of mine, Carol Short, Dr. Carol Short. And she is, and I'll let her go over her title and who she is, but she works with a company called Shadow Health, and we'll have a little interview with her. And Carol, thank you so much again for your time.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me, Brenda. I'm really excited for all your students in this class to learn more about instructional design and really envious of them to get to be having this class with you. It sounds like a lot of fun. But yeah, as Brenda said, my name's Carol. I work at Shadow Health, and Brenda and I previously worked together doing the same job at Shadow Health. And so we're a startup out of Gainesville, Florida, born at the University of Florida in a research lab, came through the Innovation Hub. When Brenda and I worked there together, we were in I don't know what's there now, Brenda, but I think it's across
Oh,
from
yeah.
Lucy's, and it used to be back in the day a hardware building, and so it was
Yeah.
big, nice, open space. And now they're downtown, a little closer to the Hippodrome. If you were ever able to really be curious about what we talked about today and want to see the rest of our colleagues and former colleagues in action, that's where they are in Gainesville. But we are a simulation software company that produces educational technology for nursing students. And so I am on the instructional design side of things. My current job title is not instructional designer, although it has been in the past, or some
Variation of it,
iteration.
right?
Yeah, I think it started out instructional design coordinator. It may even still say that on my LinkedIn, but and then we've gone through a number of different things just based on the business model, but the core functions of what we do have remained the same. And a lot of that does have to do with instructional design. My current title is customer success manager, but essentially what our team does is work one-on-one with faculty members who are integrating that educational software into their nursing classes, both at the community college undergraduate level, the university undergraduate level. Sometimes they have learners who are returning to school, so more lifelong learner populations who've been out of school for, say, 10, 20 years, and then also graduate nursing faculty. And so essentially working with them on how does our software fit as one learning activity amongst others inside their classes, and helping them make the strategic decisions as far as weighting, grading, the role of all their activities, how you sequence everything, and then very practical aspects to using our software in the class. So just like any other software, you might work with a faculty on using, how do I click the buttons in order to give these assignments to my students?
So, Carol, how did a little bit more about yourself? Like, how did you get into like the position that you're at? How did you get into Shadow? As you mentioned, you're a doctor, so you have your PhD. Because I know sometimes some of the students have kind of expressed if how do they career paths. I think some people are thinking about a career change. Some people are starting off their career. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I would say that generally, again, in my limited scope of experience meeting other instructional designers, both at instructional design conferences, but also just in my day-to-day role, where sometimes university instructional designers will join the call with us. It's not uncommon to have kind of a roundabout way of arriving in this possible career path. Although you could really start out also deciding this was going to be the career path and just go straight through. I was one of the more roundabout kind of people that, so my degrees are not in instructional design. And full disclosure, like nearly 7 years ago now, when I interviewed at Shadow Health, I was not interviewing for an instructional design role.
Mm.
I was an English doctoral student and had done media studies, so was very interested in simulation and whatnot and digital things. But I thought I was interviewing for a job on our narrative design team that
Oh,
writes
yeah.
patient stories, you know, more like a creative writing, which also isn't really what my degree was in. And it just happened that this job was open and they saw something that, I mean, I didn't even know what instructional design was. Although I'd taught college level classes, that was never something, a term that in our pedagogical classes in the English department, they had really referenced. Although now looking back, I think we had to do some of that, you know, by design.
Sure.
But anyway, so yeah, I was a PhD student, earned my degree from the English department, focused on media studies, took that career path and really did interview for some academic teaching jobs. And also, yeah, full disclosure, I had a job offer on the table to do something completely different. Yeah, work with a journal on campus when
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
a friend of mine who was on that narrative design team at Shadow Health when we were still a small startup said, before you take that job, why don't you come talk to Shadow Health? And I'm so glad I did. It's like just being open
Yeah.
to the opportunities that life sometimes presents you was really how I ended up doing this role. And um, yeah, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I absolutely love it. Again, even though I didn't even know anything about our type of software, say 10 years ago, or really what instructional design was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, aside from like the normal onboarding stuff, like Carol, I wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, this person doesn't really know what they're doing when you join the team. Like, so kind of being flexible, being open to opportunities, like how did you survive then? You know what I mean? Like you were kind of put into a situation where you may not necessarily have been super trained for, but obviously had some life skills and experiences related to it. But how did you go into that situation? First of all, I think that was really brave of you. But then how did you make it work?
Oh, well, you're so sweet, Brenda. Well, I mean, you were a big help, yeah, with all the onboarding quizzes and subject matter.
I remember that.
So I think that for anybody going into instructional design, as much as your education and classes like this would have been like a wonderful foundation that I think I would have really benefited from. A lot of, and I know you can testify to this, of what you're doing functionally in a day-to-day role, both relies on the theory and foundations that you had in school, but also in the subject matter and letting your audience, your learners, and the content that you're dealing with dictate some of the choices that you're making. So I think, thankfully, when I joined Shadow Health, we only had a smaller catalog of content to master. And so now today, for people who onboard to our team, there's just so much more subject matter wise to become very familiar with.
Mhm.
Bec- I know in some instructional design roles, you may work hand in hand with a subject matter expert to
Mhm.
make choices. In our role, we do have those people, but we also wear the hat of somewhat becoming fluent
Right.
in that language. And so I think that was really the biggest challenge. A lot of the principles, whether it's Addie or Kirkpatrick or some of the graphic design choices or designing learning activities, were definitely things I would say, having taught before and having been a strategy tutor at the university before, that I was somewhat familiar with, but maybe didn't have the language
Mhm.
coming in to that matched the same discourse community of
Mhm.
instructional design. but some of the principles. So I think even for somebody who's doing a role on our team who
Mhm.
has not studied instructional design extensively, if they have been a learner, they are at least somewhat familiar with some of these things.
Mhm.
Like, what are some best practices using empathy from a learner's perspective
Yeah.
of how you would structure this class or
Yeah.
weight these activities or keep students engaged? Um, so I think yeah, well, I don't know, Brenda, just, yeah, you got to dance with what brung you, and so it's like, but it was fun. Y'all made it really an easy transition and enjoyable to do every day.
Well, I know, I think whether we were there for a long time or not, things were, especially with the startup, it can be fluid. And I think we were like, okay, what's the new marching orders for this next sprint? Which is, for those of you unfamiliar with the terminology, a sprint is, and the agile method, a 2 week plan basically to get some goals and things taken care of. Um, and so that I know that would change quite a bit. I think one of the biggest things that happened to us was that aside from being a purely instructionally focused team, we joined the sales team and ended up also having to be like what Carol I think is doing right now too with account management, and building that success for the customer as well that was tied to a business side that I think none of us necessarily thought we would ever get into. So I think along those lines, has things changed for you since I was, and people don't know what it was like for us, but
Right.
I guess for now, if you can kind of go over like what's your daily routine, like
Yeah.
your responsibilities, so they kind of know from the day to day.
And depending on, I guess, the industry that one would work in as an instructional designer, sometimes work can be seasonal. And so that might be a question I would ask a future employer.
Yeah.
Are there busier seasons than others? And could they perhaps describe a day during the busiest season and then
Yeah.
during a different season? And maybe not every industry is like that, but definitely with educational technology, as you all might guess, the beginning of the semester is our busiest time. So in that time, probably 80% of what we're doing is more on the instructional design side,
Mhm.
where I'm meeting one-on-one with educators and talking to them very specifically about, okay, how are you laying out things in your syllabus? How are you deciding on what learning activities are the right fit for your student and what sequence of those? And how much work is the right amount of work for your learners each week? And do you want to also have some videos to go along with what we offer? So that's so enjoyable. And as Brenda remembers, during that busy season, oh, sometimes it's just you're just pressed to get another cup of water in between your calls and just not lose your voice. But again, we are so lucky.
Yeah.
So much of the, I think, quality of work, I wouldn't say quality of life, because life, of course, extends beyond work, but the quality of work is the people that we interact with. And
Mhm.
of course, you can always find something to draw joy from whoever you're working with. But especially if there's a good culture on your team and at work, but also if you're interacting with really amazing individuals like educators, it can make a huge difference. And so I'm so blessed and fortunate to work with nursing faculty. They're just really nice
They
people.
really are. They're really like the nicest faculty.
Often they could be making, I mean, being most honest, like they could make probably a lot of them more in income having chosen to not devote their lives to education. But
Mhm.
they're people who oftentimes felt called
Mhm.
to give back and to teach others. So just imagine those kind of people.
Yeah.
And that helps. So if you have to meet with 6, 7 people a day, but they're lovely people who have a heart for service, it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
But that's what a day right now looks like 80% of the time. And you're right, we do wear other hats, but I think part of that too is just really acknowledging as a business
Mhm.
that whether or not we owned the responsibility of returning revenue,
Mhm.
that what we were doing when I'll brag on Miss Brenda here.
Oh,
Because Dr. Such, but she would take meetings in the middle of the night.
wow.
There were some of her ladies out in California
Yeah.
who just needed help. And Brenda was always a can-do problem solver, as our former boss would say, and that has an influence on having customers make the decision to
Mhm.
come back and use that product again in their classes. Clearly evaluating, did this learning technology achieve the desired outcomes that I
Mhm.
want for my learners? That's going to have part of the role. And so we're very fortunate. I think we have a great product. I
Mhm.
compare it to when I used to work at an ice cream store selling Ben and Jerry's. It's like nobody came in that door and was sad to
Right.
get that ice cream.
Right.
And it's so great to work at a company where what you're offering your clients or your educators is a high quality product that makes all the difference.
Mhm.
But part of people deciding to use a high quality product again is really good service. So we do wear that hat. And there's always going to be a practical manual entry part, I think, to any job.
That's
We
true.
used to refer to this with a silly term of like
Yeah.
gerbil work. It's not fancy, but
Yeah.
it's important.
Right.
And they have automated a lot of those processes.
Good.
So it makes it very easy to look at a dashboard, not unlike your car dashboard with gauges that tell you, okay, here are some schools that the students are having low feedback. We want to reach out to them to make an intervention, even if it wasn't about revenue and dollars. We want those learners to have a great experience.
Right.
So we're
Right.
going to reach out. And then same thing there are just some educators who are so busy, they
Mhm.
require a little bit more reminding at the beginning of the semester to say, hey, were you planning on using these assignments again? And oftentimes, most of the time, the answer is, oh, yeah, I was. But they've just, as you all know, they've been so busy they just don't remember necessarily to reach out proactively to us to say, hey, can you set that up for me? And so that is a business value too, where we're reaching out just really practically with a bunch of emails and automated campaigns to say, hi, professor, may I set up your modules again for you? And that's just really easy. And we just generate their course shells in their institution in our system.
Right.
So that's during the busy season. And then during other parts of the year where we're not meeting 6, 7 times a day with faculty, or we're not reminding them to request their modules again, we do get to design more learning activities for our users. So for the faculty, we have a cartoon-based training for faculty to teach them how to do the things they need to do to set up their assignments in our system. And that was something where we did use like the ADDIE model to really determine for our audience and how they rated and their experience, how do we design something that's going to keep them as engaged as possible? And that's
Mhm.
how we ended up with a cartoon. And the first version we made was very basic. It was very much like South Park. They didn't move very much.
Right. Right. Right.
And then the art team thankfully was able to give us some resources for this more recent iteration. And it's a little more compelling now, but it's very fun to switch things up. And so that's another question for a future employer. To what degree, when your work is seasonal, do you get to assume a slightly different role
Mhm.
and make educational assets or example syllabuses in our case, or graphic organizers or training modules? And then are
Mhm.
there other tasks or roles that you would assume in that job during different times of the year? And for me and my personality and preferences, I enjoy that we do one thing really intensely. And then when that season is done,
Right.
time to do another thing.
Right. Right. So no, that's something that Carol brought up really nicely to kind of just make sure that it's emphasized too for everyone is that sometimes the work of the instructional designer is not glorious. I mean, I remember Carol and I just sitting there, just copying things into course shells or into our project management system, and or you're just checking data. So sometimes it may not be, again, the most. It's not the thing that you necessarily wake up and want to do in the morning, but it has to be done. And actually, I'm glad I'm talking to you about this, Carol, because of all the people that I've worked with, I felt like you were the one who really understood what I'm about to say. And Carol was, because sometimes you think, oh, the grunt worked. I'm just going to give it to somebody else who, maybe an intern or someone who isn't paid as much or like an ed tech. And especially when we were account managing, a lot of the details could have technically been given to like an intern or someone like that, or someone just kind of learning, onboarding while we maybe focus on the heavier lifting. But Carol brought to the point where sometimes with the details, if we don't have someone who is trained and has more experience or a higher level of critical thinking in the environment around them to do those things can fall through the cracks and end up being a bigger problem. So I remember when we were thinking about what tasks to shift around, she was a proponent to being like, okay, no, we probably need to do some of this grunt work in order to make sure things are done right. And so that something that I don't think people think about. So everyone, that was Carol. That was Carol advocating for that. So if you all think
Yeah.
about
And nothing against like an intern. It was just that they wouldn't have had
yeah, they don't
the
know the
experience.
right. Or the yeah.
Yeah. And it's not about like the, education necessarily, but yeah, it's just sometimes it does, are efficiencies built in
Mhm.
if the same person who already has an institutional knowledge of something is taking care of some of those rote tasks. So we think about efficiencies
Right,
in siloing and specializing, but sometimes there are also efficiencies in wearing multiple hats.
right.
And there's like always going to be a trade-off. And it is far above my pay grade at Shadow Health, which is now Elsevier. I forgot to mention that earlier. We
Yeah.
did have an acquisition. So we are now part of a multinational, very exciting as a startup. But still, that is something that the managers and administrators can decide as far as what's more efficient. But at least for right now, there are efficiencies built in for those people who are very familiar to take care of some of those more rote tasks. And yeah, I always try to think about it from the learner's perspective. Being a student can be so challenging.
Yeah.
And thinking about, okay, this isn't just one more class that we're setting up. That we set this up correctly ensures that these 2 students or
Sure.
20 students or 200 students have a frustration-free experience. And that's going to make their individual days and lives better, So that is hard sometimes when you're doing the 11th one of something or whatever to stay, at least for me, to stay like really
Right,
engaged,
right.
do it as high
I've
quality as
been
the
there.
first one.
Right.
But definitely keeping the learner or end user in mind can help with things like that too.
So Carol, I know, thank you so much for your time. And I know we're kind of we've just been talking for some time now. But I think my next question is going to be something that I want everyone to kind of put their ears up for because not too many people go through what Carol's going through right now. As she just mentioned with the acquisition from Shadow Health, still being Shadow Health, but being acquired by Elsevier. So some of you uh, look it up, Elsevier. I mean, when many of the journal articles that you're looking at are published by Elsevier, and so it is, and interestingly, oftentimes viewed as a publishing company now acquiring this startup tech. And I wouldn't, Shadow Health is considered a startup, but it's also been around for a while and became more of a small business, I would say. I'm talking to the students, not to you, Carol, obviously. You know your Shadow Health better than anybody. Um, so, uh, but that's something that, Carol, if you can share more about your experience, being someone related to instructional design with an educational product, being part of this company now acquired by a larger company, because I think instructional design is being viewed as more and more important with startup companies. So if people are going in this direction, and I know when I was working with you, like that feeling of like, okay, in order for our company to really succeed, it needs to be acquired by a larger company. And the time has come. And so what is that like? What is the transition like? Is the work any different? If you can kind of maybe talk more about that experience for you, which I
Sure.
think everyone is super valuable because again, you don't really get to hear this very much from people.
Yeah, yeah, my pleasure. So far, the work has been identical. Now, there are some very practical parts to, as y'all already know, to your work day that are also okay to ask about, I think, during like a job interview for a new employer.
Mhm.
So, for instance, like we're on Zoom right now. As
Right.
Brenda recalls, previously, when we first started doing virtual meetings at Shadow Health, actually, believe it or not, Zoom was not that popular. So we started with a different software to do our meetings. And we have been using that software now for 8, 9 years. I've been using it for close to 7.
Mhm.
One change with Elsevier is that we are finally on Zoom, and
Okay.
faculty are very happy about that. And so sometimes it is those very small things that are more noticeable as changes in your day to day, because it's almost like it was the water you were swimming in and not noticing every day. And now that it's different, it's like, oh, I notice every time I'm launching this Zoom meeting because that's a different thing. But our core functionality has really, for us, stayed the same. Now, I know from our product development side, Elsevier is able to give us such an infinitely higher degree of resources, even though we were doing, I would like to say, very well as an original startup and then a small business, as you were saying. We had become a very influential player in the educational healthcare simulation market. We came to brawl, you know what I'm saying? But they are able to really take it to the next level, to say, okay, well, y'all now have, close to a dozen different products across undergrad and graduate, but we want to maybe double or triple the number of products. I mean, I'm just, again, from where I sit, I don't know for sure, but I know they're going to really increase that development. And so what will that mean for our team? Oh, we're going to have to put on our learning caps and learn very quickly to say, oh, wow, we just developed as a company. Brenda and I remember when it was like you had a whole year before a new product coming out.
You're
We would
begging. You're like, can I
learn.
see somebody new, please?
And for those older products, it's like, oh man, I could tell you just the smallest little minute details about our original pharmacology, our original
Oh
changes
yeah.
to health assessment, and all the little patient details and lovely nuanced backgrounds. And so we have had to adjust, even as we've made that transition from a startup to a small company, to say, okay, now we just released, I mean, truly in the last year, like
Wow.
5, 6 new products. And
Yeah.
so making sure that as a team, we build in that time for learning, so that when we are meeting with clients or educators to teach them about how to best use these assignments in their classrooms, that I have learned, memorized, internalized everything I can about this. So I assume as Elsevier helps us pick up the speed of development, we will have to do a lot of learning at a quick pace. But I think we've, like a little lobster in a pot, we've kind of gotten used to getting faster and faster on that. So hopefully that will be pretty smooth. And then clearly there will be some things as far as like one day when we can all travel again. Well, we get to travel to their international sales conference. That's so exciting. I would love to do that.
Yeah.
There are other HR changes, just the practical things about a job that are fine to ask about. I'd like to brag on Shadow Health and say, as a small company, they gave us really good health insurance.
Yeah.
Now we still have really good with Elsevier, but even more options. So for me, as somebody who's been remote for this company for a number of years, that's great. Now I can choose amongst 4 or 5 different healthcare providers. But again, the core functionality of what I do has really remained the same. Definitely for some people at our company, there will be some shifting roles and responsibilities because there may be some overlap between what now our parent company offers and what those individuals were potentially doing before. But they have been a very welcoming
Yeah.
company during the acquisition. And I'm sure with all the companies out there in the world, that is maybe not always the case, but I can only speak highly so far of Elsevier. Brenda knows how much I love swag. We would go to the baseball
Yes.
games to get the free stuff.
Yes.
They mailed me. I should have had it this morning. Some mugs. I think
Yep.
there's a shirt coming in the mail. So that's
Oh,
all
awesome.
the way to my heart. But
Like
they've,
gold.
they've been lovely. Yeah, I think, Brenda, you'd be really impressed with
Oh,
the
good. The
clearly
swag
some
that
instructional designers involved. Yeah, they've have
Oh,
some
that's
really good
awesome.
looking slides and yeah,
Oh,
it's nice.
good, good, good. So, Caroline, again, I know we're about ready to run out of time, but do you have, I mean, great points, suggestions, encouragements. I also appreciate how you are, and if you know Carol, she's this person too, to advocate, um, just to be an advocate. And so to advocate for people to be able to ask good questions to their employers to keep that communication going and to make sure people understand even what their needs are with HR benefits, et cetera. But do you have any other kind of advice for people as kind of one last question?
And probably people who were in this program in a graduate level class, you are already inclined to be this way. And I don't know necessarily that an anonymous lady on Zoom is gonna influence you, but if I could, I would say, once again, and it's kind of embarrassing to confess, but you know what? That's okay. Um, I didn't know 10 years ago what instructional design was.
Mhm.
And the way that I ended up here in a career that I really love,
Mhm.
that feels so fulfilling and
Mhm.
brings a lot of joy to my life, was being open to something that I didn't control or necessarily envision for myself.
Mhm.
Following interests and passions
Mhm.
through shared connections led me to this company. But then it was a position or disposition, even of being open to something new, that there was something to learn. So just maintaining that posture or like that curiosity as a learner, and they like to say at work, like a growth mindset, that I, we always have room for improvement, and that there's a lot of enjoyment and joy in that process of improving and learning. So again, yeah, with these changes that we have gone through, I don't know. Yeah, what will I be doing in 10 years? It could look a lot different, but I hope to maintain that openness. And I think it's a choice every day that I'm just going to see what the day brings and bring my best, to it and try to be open as much as I can.
All right, thanks, Carol. And I think on behalf of anyone who's watching this video right now, we want to thank you for your time and sharing all the great experiences that you've had in an open, honest way. And so, yay!
Oh, thank you, Brenda. Well, everybody have a great rest of your semester. and just enjoy your time with Dr. Such. Yeah.